In the winter of 1740, the balance of power in Europe looked settled. Ancient dynasties ruled vast empires, armies marched under traditions centuries old, and the small kingdom of Prussia was widely dismissed as a minor military state on the edge of the continent. Few leaders feared it, and even fewer expected it to change the course of European history. Then a young king, only 28 years old, made a decision that stunned the courts of Europe. Within months of taking the throne, he launched a sudden invasion of a rich province belonging to the powerful Habsburg monarchy ruled by Maria Theresa. Diplomats were shocked, generals were unprepared, and the political order that had governed Europe for generations suddenly began to crack. The gamble was breathtakingly dangerous. Prussia was smaller than most of its rivals, surrounded by enemies, and dependent on a single bold campaign. If the invasion failed, the kingdom could be crushed, its territory carved apart by larger empires. Yet, if it succeeded, the young king might transform Prussia into one of the most powerful states in Europe. Over the next decades, Europe would watch a relentless struggle unfold. Coalitions would form and collapse, armies would clash across Central Europe, and entire regions would be devastated by one of the largest conflicts of the 18th century, later known as the 7 Years' War. At the center of it all stood a ruler who combined ruthless strategy, intellectual ambition, and a relentless belief in his own destiny. By the end of his reign, the map of Europe had shifted, the reputation of Prussia had been transformed, and the young king who once shocked the continent would earn a title almost no monarch received during his lifetime: Frederick the Great.
In the early 18th century, Europe was a continent defined by dynasties, armies, and delicate balances of power. Vast empires stretched across the map, each ruled by royal families who believed their authority came from tradition, bloodline, and divine right. Alliances were constantly shifting, and peace often existed only as a pause between wars. At the center of this powerful political world stood the powerful Habsburg monarchy, ruled from the glittering court of Vienna. For generations, the Habsburgs had governed a sprawling empire that included Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and territories across Central Europe. Their rulers also frequently held the title of Holy Roman Emperor, giving them enormous prestige across the fragmented German states. Yet, the Habsburg Empire was not the only major force shaping Europe's future. To the east stood the vast lands of Russia, expanding steadily under ambitious rulers. To the west, the Kingdom of France remained one of the richest and most influential powers on the continent. Meanwhile, the maritime empire of Great Britain was building a global network of trade and naval dominance. Amid these giants stood a smaller but increasingly disciplined state, Prussia. Located in northern and eastern Germany, Prussia lacked the wealth and long imperial history of its rivals. What it did possess, however, was an unusual for a kingdom of its size, an extraordinarily efficient military system. This transformation had begun under the rule of Frederick William I of Prussia, the father of the man who would later be known as Frederick the Great. Frederick William was famously austere, practical, and obsessed with discipline. He poured enormous resources into building one of the most formidable standing armies in Europe, even though his kingdom itself was relatively small and scattered. Under his rule, Prussia became a state where military organization shaped nearly every aspect of society. Taxes funded the army, government administration supported recruitment, and entire regions were structured to provide soldiers. By the time of his death in 1740, Prussia possessed an army that was disproportionately large for its population and remarkably well-trained. Yet the young prince who would inherit this system was not initially expected to become a warrior king. Frederick the Great had grown up with very different interests from his father. As a boy, he loved music, philosophy, and literature, speaking fluent French and admiring the intellectual culture of the Enlightenment. His father despised these interests. Frederick William believed kings should be soldiers first and scholars never. The conflict between father and son became legendary, and at one point the young prince even attempted to flee the kingdom to escape his father's harsh discipline. The attempt failed, and the consequences were brutal. Frederick was arrested, imprisoned, and forced to witness the execution of a close companion who had helped him plan the escape. The experience left a deep psychological mark on the future king and hardened his understanding of power and authority. Over time, Frederick reluctantly adapted to the world his father demanded. He studied military strategy, learned the mechanics of government administration, and began to understand the powerful machine his father had built. When Frederick William I died in 1740, the 28-year-old prince suddenly inherited both the throne and one of Europe's most disciplined armies. But the timing of his accession coincided with a major crisis that was about to shake the entire continent. That same year, the powerful Habsburg Emperor Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor, died without a male heir. His daughter, Maria Theresa, claimed the throne, but many European rulers immediately questioned her right to rule. The result was a moment of extraordinary uncertainty. Rival monarchs saw an opportunity to seize territory from what appeared to be a vulnerable new ruler. Diplomatic promises that once guaranteed Maria Theresa's inheritance suddenly began to collapse as ambitious kings prepared their armies. For Frederick, the temptation was irresistible. Within the Habsburg lands lay the wealthy province of Silesia, a territory rich in industry, agriculture, and strategic position. If Prussia could capture Silesia, its economic and military strength would increase dramatically. But taking it meant war with one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. It meant risking the destruction of his young reign before it had truly begun. And it meant that Frederick, the philosopher prince who once dreamed of music and poetry, would now have to gamble everything on the battlefield. In December 1740, only months after becoming king, Frederick made his decision. Prussian troops crossed the border into Silesia, and with that single move, Europe was plunged into a conflict that would soon be known as the War of Austrian Succession. The young king had taken the first step in a struggle that would define his reign and reshape the balance of power across the continent.
When Prussian troops crossed into Silesia in December 1740, the invasion seemed almost reckless. The province belonged to the Habsburg monarchy, and attacking it meant challenging the authority of Maria Theresa at the very moment she was struggling to secure her throne. Yet Frederick calculated that the young ruler was surrounded by enemies and would struggle to defend such a distant territory. At first, events appeared to favor the bold gamble. Prussian forces moved quickly, occupying much of Silesia before the Habsburg army could fully organize a response. Frederick personally accompanied his troops, eager to prove himself not just a king, but a commander worthy of the powerful army his father had built. The first major test came in April 1741 near the small village of Mollwitz. There, Prussian forces clashed with the Austrian army in the first major battle of the conflict. The fighting was chaotic and brutal, and at one point, Frederick himself briefly fled the battlefield after believing defeat was imminent. Yet the Prussian infantry held firm. Their relentless discipline eventually broke the Austrian lines, delivering a victory that shocked observers across Europe. The Battle of Mollwitz demonstrated something new and unsettling. The army of Prussia was not merely well organized, it was one of the most formidable fighting forces on the continent. Success brought new complications. Other European powers quickly sensed opportunity in the Habsburg crisis.
France, Bavaria, Saxony, and Spain all moved against the Austrian monarchy, turning what began as Frederick's calculated strike into a continent-wide struggle known as the War of the Austrian Succession. Frederick now found himself part of a much larger geopolitical storm. His initial aim was limited: seize Silesia and secure it through negotiation. But the war around him was expanding rapidly, and every victory raised the stakes. In 1742, after another successful campaign, Maria Theresa was forced to sign the Treaty of Breslau. The agreement handed most of Silesia to Prussia, marking a stunning territorial gain for Frederick's kingdom. In less than 2 years, he had doubled the industrial capacity of his state and dramatically elevated its status among Europe's powers. But victory did not bring lasting peace. Maria Theresa never accepted the loss of Silesia as final. Determined to recover the province, she began reforming her army and strengthening alliances across Europe. The conflict soon reignited, pulling Frederick once again into war. In 1744, Prussian forces marched back into Habsburg territory, beginning what historians later called the Second Silesian War. This phase of the conflict would test Frederick's leadership far more severely than the first. The turning point came in June 1745 at the Battle of Hohenfriedberg. Frederick personally directed the campaign, using rapid movement and coordinated attacks to surprise the Austrian and Saxon armies. The battle ended with a decisive Prussian victory that further solidified his reputation as a capable military commander. Another triumph followed at the Battle of Soor later that year. Once again, Frederick's forces managed to defeat a larger Austrian army through speed, discipline, and tactical coordination. These victories gradually forced Maria Theresa to accept reality on the battlefield. By the end of 1745, Austria reluctantly confirmed Prussia's control of Silesia. Frederick had achieved his initial objective, but the consequences of his actions had already begun reshaping Europe. A kingdom once considered minor had suddenly emerged as a serious rival to the Habsburg Empire. Yet victory also created new dangers. By seizing Silesia, Frederick had permanently antagonized Austria and disrupted the long-standing balance of power in Central Europe. The Habsburg monarchy began quietly searching for allies who shared a common interest, limiting Prussia's rise. During the following decade, European diplomacy underwent a remarkable transformation. Traditional alliances shifted in ways few had predicted. Austria, once a rival of France, began moving closer to the French court in a strategic realignment designed to contain Prussia. This dramatic reversal of alliances became known as the Diplomatic Revolution of 1756. It produced a powerful coalition that included Austria, France, Russia, and several smaller states. Their shared objective was simple: reverse Frederick's gains and reduce Prussia back to its previous status. Frederick understood the danger immediately. Prussia was surrounded by potential enemies whose combined populations and resources far exceeded his own. If they attacked simultaneously, the kingdom could be overwhelmed. Facing this threat, Frederick decided once again to act before his enemies were fully prepared. In August 1756, Prussian forces marched into neighboring state of Saxony, launching a preemptive strike that ignited one of the largest conflicts of the 18th century. The war that followed would spread far beyond Central Europe. Fighting erupted across multiple continents as Britain and France clashed in colonial theaters from North America to India. Historians would later call it the first truly global conflict, the 7 Years' War. For Frederick, however, the struggle was intensely personal and immediate. Prussia now faced the armies of Austria, Russia, France, and Sweden,
all determined to crush the rising power that had disrupted Europe's fragile order. The early stages of the war were filled with both brilliance and desperation. In 1757, Frederick launched a daring campaign that resulted in two of the most famous victories of his career. The first came at the Battle of Rossbach in November 1757. There, a Prussian army dramatically defeated a much larger French and Imperial force through rapid maneuver and coordinated cavalry charges. The battle lasted less than 2 hours, but became one of the most stunning victories in European military history. Only weeks later, Frederick faced another enormous challenge in Silesia. At the Battle of Leuthen, his forces confronted a larger Austrian army that had already recaptured much of the province. Using precise marching formations and deceptive movements, Frederick executed one of the most famous tactical maneuvers of the era. His army struck the Austrian flank with devastating effect, shattering their lines and reclaiming control of Silesia. Victories like Rossbach and Leuthen turned Frederick into a legend across Europe. Admirers praised his strategic brilliance, while enemies increasingly viewed him as the central obstacle preventing their coalition from defeating Prussia. But the war was far from decided. By 1759, the coalition against Prussia began to regain momentum. Russian armies pushed westward, while Austrian armies advanced from the south, threatening to overwhelm Frederick's increasingly exhausted troops. At the Battle of Kunersdorf in August 1759, the Prussian army suffered one of its most catastrophic defeats. Combined Russian and Austrian forces inflicted devastating losses, leaving Frederick's army shattered and retreating. The defeat was so severe that Frederick reportedly wrote that everything was lost except honor. For a moment, it appeared that Prussia itself might collapse under the weight of the coalition pressing from all sides. Yet the war still had several years to unfold, and the fate of Prussia remained uncertain. Even Frederick himself could not know that the next turning point in the conflict would come not from the battlefield, but from an unexpected political upheaval far beyond his borders.
By the beginning of 1762, the situation for Prussia looked almost hopeless. Years of constant warfare had exhausted its economy, devastated its countryside, and reduced its armies to a fraction of their former strength. Frederick had fought brilliant campaigns, but he was surrounded by enemies whose resources seemed endless. To the east, massive Russian armies had repeatedly pushed deep into Prussian territory. In 1760, Russian forces had even briefly occupied Berlin, a humiliating moment that revealed just how vulnerable the kingdom had become. Meanwhile, Austrian armies continued pressing from the south, determined to reclaim the lost province of Silesia. Frederick understood the grim reality. His enemies could afford to lose armies and replace them. Prussia could not. Each defeat threatened the very survival of the state he had spent 2 decades building. The previous years had already brought disaster. After the crushing defeat at Kunersdorf in 1759, Frederick's military strength had nearly collapsed. Although he managed to rebuild his forces and continue fighting, his position grew weaker with each campaign season. By 1761, the war had reached a grinding stalemate. Prussian forces were stretched thin across multiple fronts, defending fortresses and supply lines while attempting to prevent enemy armies from linking up. Frederick himself admitted privately that the situation had become desperate. Yet in early 1762, an event occurred that Frederick could never have predicted. In January, the powerful ruler of Russia, Elizabeth of Russia, suddenly died. Her death triggered a dramatic shift in the politics of the war. Her successor, Peter III of Russia, admired Frederick deeply and had long viewed Prussia as a model state. Almost immediately after taking the throne, he reversed Russia's entire war policy.
Instead of continuing the campaign against Prussia, Peter ordered Russian troops to withdraw and negotiated peace with Frederick. The sudden change stunned Europe. A powerful enemy that had nearly destroyed Prussia was now gone from the battlefield. Even more astonishing, Peter III briefly offered military support to Frederick, transforming a former adversary into an ally. Frederick himself later referred to this moment as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Without Russia's armies pressing from the east, the coalition against Prussia began to fracture. Austria suddenly found itself fighting without one of its strongest partners. The shift did not immediately end the war, but it changed the strategic balance overnight. Frederick could now concentrate his remaining forces against Austria and its remaining allies. The pressure that had nearly crushed Prussia slowly began to ease. During the campaigns of 1762, Prussian forces regained the initiative in several regions of Silesia and Saxony. Frederick continued to rely on rapid maneuver, disciplined infantry, and aggressive tactics that had defined his earlier victories. Although the fighting remained intense, the existential threat facing Prussia had begun to fade. Meanwhile, diplomatic exhaustion spread across Europe. After years of devastating conflict, many of the major powers were simply running out of money, soldiers, and political will. The war that had once promised sweeping victories now seemed increasingly pointless. Negotiations gradually gained momentum. Britain, which had supported Prussia financially and strategically during the conflict, also sought an end to the enormous global war it was fighting against France. Across Europe and overseas, leaders were ready to restore peace. In February 1763, representatives of the major powers gathered to finalize a settlement. The resulting agreement, known as the Treaty of Hubertusburg, effectively ended the long struggle between Prussia and Austria. The terms of the treaty were surprisingly simple. Despite 7 years of brutal warfare, the borders of Central Europe changed very little. Most importantly, however, Austria formally recognized Prussia's control over Silesia. For Frederick, the result was nothing less than extraordinary. Against overwhelming odds, his kingdom had survived a war against some of Europe's most powerful states. The province that had triggered the entire conflict remained firmly in Prussian hands. But the true significance of the moment went far beyond territory. The survival of Prussia had transformed Frederick's reputation across the continent. No longer seen as a reckless young king, he was now widely regarded as one of Europe's most formidable military leaders. The war had tested every aspect of his rule: strategy, endurance, and political calculation. At several moments, defeat had seemed inevitable. Yet through a combination of battlefield skill, stubborn resilience, and extraordinary luck, Frederick had emerged victorious from one of the most dangerous conflicts of the 18th century. And with that survival came a new reality. The kingdom that had once been dismissed as a secondary state now stood firmly among the great powers of Europe. When the war finally ended in 1763, Prussia was exhausted. Entire regions had been ravaged by marching armies, farmland lay abandoned, and the population had suffered years of taxation and hardship. Yet despite the devastation, the kingdom had achieved something extraordinary. It had survived a coalition of Europe's most powerful states and emerged stronger than before. For Frederick the Great, the end of the 7 Years' War marked the beginning of a different phase of his reign. The decades that followed were not dominated by great continental wars, but intense efforts to rebuild, reform, and strengthen the state he had nearly lost. Frederick focused heavily on economic recovery. Large areas of farmland destroyed during the war were resettled and cultivated again. New agricultural techniques were encouraged, and crops such as the potato were promoted across Prussia to help prevent famine and stabilize food supplies.
At the same time, Frederick expanded state administration with remarkable efficiency. Government officials were expected to work with strict discipline and honesty, reflecting the same structured mindset that had shaped the Prussian army. Taxes were reorganized, infrastructure improved, and trade gradually revived in regions damaged by years of conflict. Frederick also saw himself as a ruler of the Enlightenment. He corresponded with philosophers, supported religious tolerance, and attempted to modernize the legal system of his kingdom. His court welcomed intellectuals and artists, and he maintained a long intellectual relationship with the French philosopher Voltaire. Yet Frederick's Enlightenment ideals existed alongside a highly centralized and disciplined state. The monarchy retained strong authority, and the military remained central to Prussian society. The army continued to receive enormous resources, ensuring that the kingdom would remain prepared for future conflicts. Frederick's influence on the military art of Europe was profound. His use of rapid movement, coordinated infantry formations, and aggressive battlefield tactics became classic models for later commanders. Generations of officers across Europe analyzed his campaigns, including figures who would shape the next era of warfare. Among those who admired Frederick's methods was Napoleon Bonaparte, who studied his campaigns decades later while rising through the French army. Frederick's victories at battles such as Rossbach and Leuthen remained classic examples of maneuver warfare long after his death. Meanwhile, the political consequences of Frederick's reign continued to unfold across Central Europe. By securing Silesia and demonstrating Prussia's military strength, Frederick had permanently altered the balance of power within the German states. Prussia now stood as the primary rival to the Austrian monarchy within the fragmented structure of the Holy Roman Empire. This rivalry between Austria and Prussia would shape the politics of Central Europe for generations. It would influence diplomatic alliances, military planning, and eventually the future unification of Germany in the 19th century. Frederick ruled for more than 2 decades after the end of the 7 Years' War. By the time he died in 1786, his kingdom had become one of the most respected and feared powers on the European continent. The small state that had once been dismissed by larger empires now possessed immense military prestige and growing political influence. His legacy was complex. Frederick had been a patron of philosophy and culture, yet also a ruler who believed strongly in military power and disciplined authority. He expanded education, law, and agriculture, but he also built a state whose identity was closely tied to the army. Still, few rulers of the 18th century reshaped their country so dramatically. Through bold risk, relentless warfare, and decades of reform, Frederick transformed Prussia from a secondary kingdom into a central player in European politics. And in doing so, he helped lay the foundations for a new balance of power that would shape Europe long after his reign had ended.
When Frederick the Great died in 1786, he left behind a kingdom very different from the one he had inherited. When he first took the throne, Prussia was a disciplined but relatively minor state, overshadowed by larger empires and older dynasties. By the end of his reign, it had become one of the most powerful military and political forces in Europe. Frederick achieved this transformation through bold decisions that repeatedly placed his kingdom on the edge of destruction. His invasion of Silesia triggered wars that could easily have ended in disaster. Yet, through strategy, persistence, and moments of extraordinary luck, he managed to survive conflicts against coalitions that far outmatched his resources. His reign also captured a contradiction that defined much of 18th century Europe. Frederick admired Enlightenment philosophy, supported intellectual life, and believed a ruler should serve the interests of the state. At the same time, his kingdom remained built on discipline, hierarchy, and one of the most powerful armies on the continent. Historians still debate which aspect of Frederick mattered more. Was he primarily a brilliant military commander who reshaped the balance of power, or an enlightened monarch who modernized his state through reform? The answer may lie somewhere in between. What is certain is that Frederick's choices permanently altered the political landscape of Central Europe. The rivalry he intensified between Prussia and Austria would shape the future of the German states for generations and eventually influence the path toward German unification in the 19th century. And that leaves a fascinating question. If Frederick had not taken the enormous risk of invading Silesia in 1740, would Prussia have remained a minor kingdom on Europe's edge, or would history have found another way to elevate it? If you enjoyed this story of ambition, war, and transformation, let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more cinematic deep dives into the leaders and events that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe for the next journey into history.